we're going to continue this afternoon with a very important panel discussion, enabling expeditionary logistics in a joint and multinational environment. You can already see from the uniforms of the panelists here that we are indeed joint and multinational. I want to welcome Vice Admiral Andy Brown, the Joint Staff J4, who's going to chair this, along with our moderator and return offender here, Lieutenant General Kathy Gainey, who will introduce the rest of the panel. Kathy, please.
Well, what a wonderful afternoon, and I know that you all are pumped up for this afternoon, and we're, of course, saved the most complex and interesting topic and brought to you a good sea flavor for this afternoon to keep you awake. I say sea flavor because Andre is the only other Army person up here, basically. Well, that's true. That's it. Our panel is about expeditionary logistics in a joint and multinational environment. And as you know, the military, we are going to have a very different time in these next, couple of decades, because deployments are going to be different. Contingencies are going to be different for not only the United States, but for our partner nations. As we're already experiencing, life is different from what it has been for the past 15 years. And that's going to take us some time to rethink how do we do things. In some ways, we're going to be going back to the ways of old, as I said earlier, when we old dogs deployed. We will bring back some of those life skills. But we will also have to learn some new skills because the environment has changed. The threat has changed. How we operate as a joint force, I think we've done a marvelous job, and we're going to take those good lessons learned forward. How we've evolved in working with our international partners, I think, is much, much better than it was before. And we're going to get back to continuing with that, because I don't think any of our nations want to lose what we learned and the value of operating as a coalition team. But that means that we have to exercise together, we have to train together, we have to be inoperable. And you heard in the other panels about the need for us, the United States, to become much better at STANAGs, for us to become a more expeditionary force, for us to learn about the value of nation building and what we're working in our foreign military sales to do just that, with, of course, Department of State and with OSD to look at how do we ensure that the partner agreements we have with nations are ready. So let me start off with introducing Vice Admiral Andy Brown. He is no stranger to this crowd. Andy is an old friend and somebody that has taken positions to new levels. Every time he has gone into a position that I have ever had, he's made it 10 times better, and I thank you for leaving few marks about my mistakes. I appreciate that. Andy is currently, of course, the Joint Staff J4 Director. Before that, of course, he was in Transcom as the Deputy Commander, and he fleeted up from being the J54. But before that, of course, he was the UCOM J4. So he understands what it is to be forward deployed and have those challenges, but he also understands what our coalition partners bring to the table and the value of them. So Andy, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, General Gainey, and it's great to see you. And you're the one who was successful ahead of me, so thank you for bringing me along. And I just want to thank General Swain and General Perna for focusing in on logistics, because a lot of times the operational side of the force loses the picture that that operations always include logistics, and it's sometimes we need to stop and really consider the strategic implications of what we're doing in the fight and where we're going in the future. So, Kathy, are you going to introduce everybody as we? So I'm going to say a few words, and then and I think I had a chart. If we could bring that up, but what I kind of, the value I can bring to you guys is to really kind of talk about what the chairman is thinking about right now. And the chairman is thinking mostly about three things. And we're going to start organizing the joint staff around this. So it's going to be globally integrated operations. And that's you know, we have O plans, and each COCOM has certain COCOMs have their plans, but we're going to try to start from the joint staff in more of a strategic view of before we start putting the O plans together. So, you know, like what are we trying to accomplish as a nation when we put these family of plans together? So it'll be that global integration in terms of planning across the broad spectrum of missions that we have. And really the chairman talks about 4+1, and I don't know if you all talked about that today, but it's the 4 major challenges of Iran and North Korea, Russia, and China, and then the +1 being the counterterrorism. So that's the global integration of those efforts. And if you think about that, we haven't really approached it in that manner in the past. We've approached it from pretty much a geographic standpoint. So we're going to be working a lot with the COCOMs to develop this. The other thing he really talks about is global command and control and best military advice to the secretary and to the president. So we're going through a lot of discussions right now with regard to what does global command and control mean, and you know, why is it required, and how do you maintain the civilian oversight, but also become more agile in how we. And I'm sure you've talked about the need to be more agile and deploy quicker and be light and et cetera. But it all comes down to orders and writing orders and sending people out the door. And so we're not very agile at doing that. And so we've got to become better at the planning side. How many cycles we can plan within, and then get the recommendations up faster, so that our adversaries won't be planning inside of our planning horizon, which happens quite a bit right now. So the third thing that he's focused on is the force of the future. I would say in that it would be the readiness of the current force, and then but also the development of the kind of warriors that we need. And when I say warrior, I include logisticians. And if you look at, especially, you know, I'm very proud of my logistician aides who have 7 or 8 stripes on their sleeves and their majors. You know, it's just amazing what our logisticians, and particularly in the Army and the Air Force, have been through since 9/11. But these are our leaders of the future. We've got to make sure that they're resilient in their families and whatnot. But you also have to realize that the chairman's replacement is already in the military. So in 2050, that's 34 years from now, his replacement, he might have 36 years under his belt, or 37 or so. But that replacement is we're already shaping those the thoughts and the training of those folks that are going to be in the military when 2050 rolls around. I hope some of us are still here, but so that's kind of give you some perspective on what the chairman is trying to focus on. And so all of the tanks right now are really designed around bringing the Joint Chiefs together, putting aside the service perspectives, but really having them come together as a Joint Chiefs around this, each one of the 4+1 problems. So they come together and decide, hey, what is our best military advice going to be to the Secretary with regard to the 4+1. So right now that's where we're focused, but then we're also focused on this global C2. And so the C2 aspect is really interesting because you get into, in logistics, you get, okay, do we have a global COP? How do we control logistics? And we can't really control anything. That's one thing I've learned on the Joint Staff is I don't really control anything, but I influence a lot. So by asking a lot of questions and whatnot. But there are times where we do have to adjudicate. And so most of the time everything kind of runs okay. Services are taking care of things. Andre Peggy is taking care of things at CENTCOM, but every once in a while Andre might need a few more munitions than he has on hand, and we have to move them around the globe in order to keep Andre's air tasking order fully supported. So then Andre and I have a discussion about moving things around, and I have a discussion with the other COCOMs, and we figure it out. So this is just one example of adjudications that have to happen across logistics, and I contend that's a form of C2 in itself. I think you've all talked about anti-access area denial. We can talk a lot about that, some of which but got to be careful about, because one of the things that we're trying to do is be a little more opaque about what we're working on, maybe not give all our secrets away. The chairman also speaks a lot about trans-regional, multi-domain, multifunctional. Sounds a lot like joint coalition, but it's space. It's cyber. It's offensive. It's defensive, and our warriors have to be able to operate in all of those zones. So I hopefully in the time that I've spent, I give you a little perspective on what's going on in the Joint Staff today. A lot of focus on the current fight, and you see it coming together quite a bit. I will just make one comment. Today we were in the paper. Army was in the paper with with regard to contractors on the battlefield, and so this is another area that we're really focused on is the contracting that's necessary to support current operations in the battlefield nowadays. So last time I was in Iraq and Afghanistan with Andre, it's apparent that that's one of the ways that we maintain our ability to support the advise and assist is to have more contracting in the battlefield. It's just a fact of life. So we're going to continue to focus on our ability to do what we call operational contracting support. So that'll continue to be one of our major lines of effort. Kathy.
Thank you, Admiral Brown. Our next panelist is Major General Andre Pregui. As you had seen earlier, Andre is the Director of Logistics down at U.S. Transcom. Previously, he was the Commanding General for the 21st Theater Support Command, and before that, he was the J4 and Combined Forces C4 for United States Forces Korea. He has a lot of building time and tactical time and served on many, many deployments. General Peggy.
Well, thank you, ma'am. And again, it's a great opportunity to serve on such a distinguished panel. And thank you again, ma'am, for your mentorship over the years. And Admiral Brown, thank you for this opportunity.
I heard I'm the only one Navy guy in the right uniform.
This morning, Vince, we counseled Vince appropriately after he left. But I want to mention, start out that as a COCOM 4, I've been fortunate to have Admiral Brown as the deputy TRANSCOM commander and now as the 4. And we've have had great success. But there have been a couple of occasions where, at least at the 2-star level, we could not get to yes. And all I've had to do was call Admiral Brown, and then he said yes, and then said, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" And he's always leaning forward and been a great supporter of everything U.S. Central Command. So, sir, I want to publicly thank you for all the great support that you have provided us, and we hopefully that will help you give us those munitions we've been asking you for. I've been asked, General Gainey and Admiral Brown asked me to talk about the Army support to other services. And as you all know, from a Title 10 perspective, Army has always been the go-to service and the go-to source for sustainment to both the joint and the combined enterprise. You look no further than Afghanistan with US-4A, and you look at the CJTF currently in Iraq. They provide the backbone and hub for sustainment for majority of the operations there. I've talked a good bit about contracting this morning in just about every panel, and you've heard Admiral Brown talked about the importance of OCS and operational contracting on the battlefield. What we've stood up at CENTCOM is the first ever, I believe, flag officer level OCS operation contracting support integration cell led by Brigadier General Paul Perdue. Now, we've had other flag officer contracting organizations that managed and executed contracting, but this organization strictly is to integrate and synchronize contracting across the entire component and joint force with the operators. This is a commander's program. It's not a contracting issue, but it's a commander's issue. And we've had in both Joe Bannister, and he's the senior logistician in Afghanistan. That's what I like to tell him. And he's embraced that role. He really is. That's what his task and purpose and mission is. And Joe McFarland, we're very fortunate that he really bought into this before his deployment. He trained his headquarters, his staff. He has manned his OXIC cell, and it has reaped significant benefits. And we are better prepared to execute sustainment and distribution operations across the battlefield because of this contracting integration planning that's injected early on into the planning stage when we initiate the operational planning. Truly has been a success for us. And the Army continues to provide support to the Department of State, to other interagency organizations, as well as our NGO and humanitarian affairs organizations. So Army's continuous support to other services continue to be important. If I can go to the next slide and last slide. And I'll end with, I don't know if Jennifer is still here, Jennifer Z. She leave? So I can talk about her then. I won't contradict anything that she said. I think she was absolutely right. But I will tell you from the CENTCOM perspective, we need FMS to execute at the time of battle, at the time of war, at the time of contingency operations, although it's not designed for that. So she's absolutely right in her comments. But our customers, our GCC partners, when they ask for munitions, when they ask for supplies, when they ask for equipment, and we want them to execute operations, we need that equipment in a relatively short period of time. So there's some work to be done, I think, with our system, and we're working that with Admiral Brown and OSD. It still is a system that I think a processes that can be improved upon, and we're working with the enterprise to try and improve those. And the last thing, General Gainey talked about access. We rely on access heavily with all of our countries in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. And we can provide them services, we can provide them aircraft, we can provide them lift if we have these authorities already built into the agreements. And actually is the best example that I can think of that gives us the ability and capability to execute tasks for our not only joint forces, but in particular in this case, our coalition partners. And I'll stop there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, General McGee. Our next panelist, I'm jumping over to our Canadian partner, Rear Admiral Truelove. He is currently has command of the Maritime Forces Pacific and Joint Task Force Pacific. He is the deputy, before that he was the deputy for Strategic Communications Directorate in ISAF in Kabul, Afghanistan. So he understands the complexity of our world. Before that he was the Commandant and Vice Chancellor for the Royal Military College of Canada, and had previously been the Special Assistant of the Vice Chief of Staff of Defense and Special Advisor to the Chief of the Defense Staff. Admiral Truelove.
Thanks very much, ma'am, and good afternoon. Thrilled to be here in Washington. I'm actually living here in Washington now, working at the embassy, and privileged to be part of this panel, humbled to be with this audience as a ship driver by trade, but having done a few other things along the way. And as I was prepping for the session, fond memories of having been the executive officer of one of our replenishment ships, doing 24-hour cycles with ships from all of our nations lined up, coming in, getting gas, getting ammunition, getting food, and a reminder to me of the importance of everything we talk about here, which is ultimately about sustaining the warfighter forward in the fight and doing it in a way that's coordinated across all of us. The panel is entitled Enabling Expeditionary Logistics, and as I was pondering that title, I was thinking, you know, most of what we do from a Canadian perspective is expeditionary. When I think about distance and space, when I think about sustaining things in the Arctic, where you fly into the southern Arctic and you think you're there, and then you get on a herc and you fly for 7 hours to get up to the northern Arctic over the most austere conditions, and I think about how we would sustain over the long term in a joint and combined manner operations in that environment. I think that is something that's very, very important. From a Canadian perspective, the logistics framework has undergone considerable change over the last while, including recently standing up a J4 strategic logistician in our headquarters, in our strategic joint staff next to the chief, to provide that strategic advice, that synchronization of logistics efforts across all of our operations. And we're certainly learning a ton from our allies as we stabilize and move forward with that position. Some of you will know Brigadier General Neville Russell, who has that title at the moment, and he passes his regrets that he can't be here. But I know he's putting a great deal of focus on this effort of combined and coordinated logistics on behalf of Canadian Armed Forces, something that is very near and dear to our Chief of Defence Staff. He's looking at everything from oversight of CSS readiness to getting the right munitions into the right places at the right time. And in doing that, helping to shape those requirements looking to the future, learning from operations that we've done alongside all of you around the world over years, and then bringing that forward in terms of future capabilities that we're going to need to work with you all on to obtain, and then to continue to ensure that we enjoy the highest levels of interoperability. And I know that's been discussed a lot already today, but from a coalition point of view, that interoperability framework will be so important. And being able to do that in a constrained environment, both at home and abroad, all important. And also recognizing that none of this is cheap. And again, I go back to the Arctic example, where we know that operating there, it's 4 times as expensive as anywhere else in the world to push stuff up into the Arctic, to sustain exercises and training up there. And you can extrapolate that forward to sustaining operations if we had to up in that region. Also being ready in advance around the world to roll in and set up and conduct operations quickly. As I'm sure many of you are aware, one of the things we've done is started creating operational support hubs around the globe. I recall not all that long ago when I was the commander, the Pacific commander, getting on a plane and traveling to Kuwait and signing an MOU where we stood up an operational hub in preparation. And here we are not that much later, and that hub is fully functioning and indeed is an instrumental part of sustaining our effort over in that region. So important steps that we took there. But from a Canadian perspective, clearly it's all about the partnerships. It's all about how we will be able, going back to the 4+1, to bring the coalition together and push it into theaters wherever they may be, if necessary, and sustain. And that could include revisiting things that we've done in the past, transiting the Atlantic en masse, convoys, sustaining. Have we thought about that in a while? What if we had to do it on the other side of the continent and go the other way? What would that all look like, and how would we do it in an integrated, coordinated fashion across those very long lines of communication? Something to consider. Recognizing time's running out here, the other thing I would mention is, from a Canadian perspective, we've just kicked off a defense policy review, the first time since 2008 that we're doing an end-to-end look at the government's direction at who we are, what we want to be in the future, and how we may need to reset for that next bound. And so we're going through a consultation process at the moment with an objective of rolling that all up through the fall and coming out with a new defense policy late winter. And I think the logistics aspect of sustaining the Canadian Armed Forces in the future will be a very, very important element of that defense policy review. And then finally, as I've already heard mentioned in all of this, it's never lost on me as an operator that the enemy does get a vote. The enemy does get a vote in all of this, and how are we thinking about their logistics supply chains? Where are the vulnerabilities there? Where are the opportunities there? And how does that fit into any planning that we might be doing? And with that, I'll stop and look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Commodore Kite from the United Kingdom. He is currently the head of the Defense Logistics Operations and Capability on the staff of the Chief of Defense Staff. Before that, he was the Secretary and Executive Assistant to the First Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Staff. And before that, he was the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Logistics Operations and Plans in the Navy Command Headquarters. Commodore.
Ma'am, thank you for those words of introduction. And can I just say, it's a huge privilege to be asked to speak this afternoon at this conference on the UK's perspective on enabling expeditionary logistics. I think what the only couple of points I'd say by sort of way of introduction is, although I'm sitting here in a blue suit, I am a joint logistician, and I have been engaged in joint logistics now for some sort of 10 or more years. So I think I've got certainly the background to be able to give you a perspective this afternoon. And also, I'd just like to say how delighted I am that Admiral Brown chose to wear his blue suit today, because, of course, I'm wearing mine, which was designed to be worn in the North Atlantic on an open bridge, not in Washington, D.C. at 80 degrees and 70% humidity. So if I start to begin to melt before you, that's why. I think a couple of words of context, I think, is relevant. And I think, like the United States, the UK is emerging from some 13 years or more of campaigning. And I think from a logistics perspective, we became extremely comfortable with the assurance that was offered by well-found bases, by well-found infrastructure, and established, and moreover, a very well-resourced support chain. We had much resilience in our lines of communication. We were quite averse to taking risk. And in many respects, it was an uncontested information space. But the new norm is very, very different. Right now, the UK is engaged with forces committed globally on some 25 different operations. And for a military of our scale, that's a significant demand. As we've heard today, many of those operations are in very austere conditions. Often they're very small in scale and often engaged in delivering non-kinetic effect, but each one has to be sustained, each one has to be given the right level of support. And at the same time, we're trying to develop and, of course, maintain very high readiness forces, joint forces that are able to deploy globally to meet any operational requirement from, at one end of the scale, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And who'd have thought we'd be deploying a joint force to Sierra Leone not that long ago to fight Ebola? That certainly wasn't something that we had prepared for, right through to being able to deploy to the eastern borders of NATO, southern and eastern borders of NATO, to secure those borders. And I think also, as has been alluded to throughout today, the logistic context has also changed. Contractors, as we've heard increasingly today, are a prominent feature on the battlefield. Platforms, particularly as they increase in complexity, seem to have a greater reliance on specialist OEMs to deliver the maintenance and repair. And the data environment, as has been mentioned a number of times this morning, has become more complex, and cyber sits out there as a very real threat. And of course, there is always that pressing need to deliver value for money, never more so than in the logistics space. So my General Angus Fay, who is a partner in crime with Admiral Brown here, has two words to describe the sort of work that we are doing to try and transform the UK logistics space, and that's complexity and simultaneity. And those two words are the dominant features as we seek to try and reset joint logistics to meet the demands of this new contingent era. So what are some of those main challenges we face as we try to adapt to this new context? So we talked a lot this morning about the deployment challenge, the ability to try and get anywhere in the world quickly. And we know that if you want to do that, then you need assured access to national, sovereign, multimodal strategic lift at the right readiness. But we also need to acknowledge that it's not just about that. It has to be backed up by responsive commercial contracts. Right now, one of my prime responsibilities in the Ministry of Defence is the lead strategic planner for the NATO Very High Readiness Task Force, which the UK is the framework nation in 2017. And trying to find the right responsiveness for heavy lift, heavy ground lift, rail and road in Europe is one of the things that keeps me awake at night. You need a global network of logistic nodes. You need the logistic intelligence to understand the network capacities and shortfalls, and you need the legal framework of agreements and partners, of agreements with partners and allies to provide the necessary access, basing, and overflight. And what we're learning as we work with the 21st TSA and General Dwayne over in Germany is that freedom of movement cannot be assumed, particularly if you're trying to move in a sort of pre-Article 5 peacetime scenario. And we also have to acknowledge, and this is something that we are trying to get the financiers to understand, that if you are going to move rapidly, you have to have forces at readiness, and that comes at a cost. And the cost of readiness is quite often not something that is factored in to the equation. I won't really labour too much more on the contractor issue, except to say for the UK, there is an additional factor, an additional complication for us, in that we have, as many of you may be aware, outsourced and contractorised our strategic base in terms of both the distribution and warehousing, and we've also contracted out and gone into an outsourcing arrangement for our main military port. So that brings for us a requirement to have a very different approach to the relationship with industry, which is much more partnership oriented than a transactional one. So we need to be able to conduct collaborative planning. The OPSEC issues have to be overcome. We have to create the ability to closely manage our deployed contractors. And I was very interested to hear what Jay had to say about the US experience of that this morning. And I think there's work we can do together to share experience there by using what we call sponsored reserves to try and give a much more responsive and assured contractor support, because we're finding in many cases the contractors don't turn up where you want them to turn up. A number would not go to Sierra Leone because of the risk of Ebola, for example. And we've also got to include them in your deployment planning. You can't put the contractors at the very last level of your desired order of arrival. In many cases, if you've outsourced the key outputs, you've got to put them right at the top. And also, you've got to understand the full extent of the risk you're carrying. In the area of sustainment, and I am well over time, but I flew all the way from England, so I'm going to have my 5 penneth worth of time. In sustaining the joint force, you have to be able, what we're learning now is you've got to be much more agile. You've got to be much more responsive, and you've got to have a credibility in your sustainment planning. And it's got to be tailored to meet both the operational design and the commander's effects that he's trying to deliver. And you have to take into account the environmental and geographic factors. What we have got into the mindset of is of slavishly following doctrine, which is just to outload 30 days of supply, because that's what we've always done. We've now got to take into account a whole load more factors, whether that is prepositioned stock, the maturity of the host nation support that is able to be provided, the availability of contractual instruments, and the robustness of your own national joint supply chain. And I think stockpiles is one area that we're really learning that we've got to come at this differently. The days of being able to have vast quantities of stock tied up, sat in warehouses, we for the UK just don't have the resources to be able to do that. So we've got to look at it differently, consider the agility of the commercial supply contracts and the industrial capacity. And there's a NATO linkage to this, which General Dwayne and I at the 21st have spoken at some length about in the last few weeks, which is the collective solution approach from a NATO perspective. And of course, if you want to achieve all that, then you've got to be able to have the data and the management information to make those informed decisions. And you've got to be able to manipulate and interrogate that data. And I think in the UK, we're a very long way from being able to do that. And then I think the final point I would just make is really about alliances and working together and interoperability. We have to be, I think, ready and willing to share the logistic burden wherever we can and provide assured support to each other. And I think that's the key. It's about assured support. In the Middle East, we work closely with all our allies. It would be invidious of me to identify any one or other, but whether it's Australia, whether it's Canada, whether it's the US or Spain, in some way, shape or form, we're working with all of those allies to ensure the logistic support in Djibouti area of responsibility. But I think in the contingent space, I think we have to be able to try and avoid the national stovepipes and consider multilateral solutions, multinational solutions wherever we can. So we have to be able to delegate and empower our operational and tactical commanders to allow them to overcome the national caveats and the legal, financial, and security restrictions, which can often hamper our ability to genuinely share the burden in a responsive and dynamic fashion. And I think the key to this is understanding what we can do in advance to construct the necessary framework and relationships needed to enable that sort of rapid decision-making. And I think a point that has been made on a number of occasions this morning, it's about getting the level of interoperability ambition right, which will drive that in many respects. And right now, the biggest challenge we're facing from the VJTF perspective is trying to bring 14 different nations together into a cohesive brigade to go and respond rapidly to the threat from the east. That's all from me. Thank you.
Commodore Kite, thank you very, very much. And last but not least is Ms. Bencote. She is the Director of Planning, Programs, and Analysis in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Previously, she was the Associate Director for International and Interagency Programs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, the Comptroller. And before that, she was a research assistant in the Center of Naval Analysis. So she's well suited to be on this panel with her naval counterparts. Ma'am.
Thank you, General Gainey. So many of you in the audience will remember, and maybe some of you have personal experience in managing the access, basing, and overflight issues that we worked through in the early 2000s as we were building coalitions to support operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And these issues have proven to carry through our 15-year experience as we have tried to ensure redundant lines of air and ground communication. I have some wounds, maybe some of you do. A great many of these issues had diplomatic and political military elements associated with them. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that interface in the Paul Mill and the diplomatic world, and how we manage our expeditionary multinational operations with that backdrop. So several presenters today, you've heard about the issues of projecting and sustaining forces in expeditionary operations. So I am going to focus on a couple of those Paul Mill related challenges. And I'm going to use the NATO experience in the last year or so as a benchmark. So as you're aware, 2014, the Wales Summit, NATO took on new initiatives to reinvigorate our ability to operate within the European theater itself. And so one of these important actions is the Readiness Action Plan, and then we heard about the VJTF. We have learned that there are some challenges that we need to address. So associated with the VJTF, there is also going to be 6 new command and control centers. They're known as the NATO Force Integration Units, these NIFUs, and they will be in Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. The degree to which we can support RAP in enhancing NATO's freedom of movement is going to hinge on some very basic, bureaucratic, but essential elements where we have, for example, all of the tools in place to be able to manage border crossing, custom clearance arrangements. We have to deal with our en route transportation infrastructure issues, and then we have to deal with our in-place infrastructure. How are we going to manage hosting, staging, and onward movement of allied forces throughout the European theater? These are all things that we haven't dealt with in a long time. And the NATO that I sort of grew up with, and I think most of you all are most familiar with, the Cold War NATO, doesn't exist anymore. So NATO is a new dynamic. We have nearly doubled the number of partners that the alliance had for the longest time. We were at 16. Decisions at 28 are challenging. Many of our new partners have never had to plan for and exercise the movement of significant forces through Europe, and they don't have the infrastructure to be able to support such an activity set. So we're working. Admiral Brown and I spent some time at NATO in trying to help facilitate forward thinking and planning for how we're going to help the alliance and individual nations help us help ourselves as each of us take part in various exercises. And I think the point was made, and it's very important, that we need to exercise the way we fight. And border crossing, customs clearance, those types of issues are critical. We have had some progress over the last year or so. A number of the nations have really taken on this issue to heart. We've had legislative changes in a variety of parliaments. We've improved processes. We still have some work to do, but I think one of the important things is that we have helped advance the dialogue on this.